Welcome back to our study of the book of Daniel. In this video, we're going to study Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 to 13. Let's begin by reading the text. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, "I've had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means." So we see that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that disturbs his sleep, and he calls in the different kinds of wise men that he has at his disposal. He has quite a retinue, and he tells them that he needs to know what the dream means. Nebuchadnezzar has a lot of wise men because dreams and their interpretation are a significant feature of discerning the future and hearing from the gods in Babylon, and also of the role of wise men and advisors to the royal court. These wise men would consult their dream books in the Babylonian language to explain the meaning of a dream. The importance of dreams and their interpretation to the Babylonian king would explain why God chooses to communicate using dreams to Daniel in this context. Whereas in Israel, God communicated mostly through prophetic oracles, that is, through prophets who conveyed messages by saying, "Thus says the Lord." Here in Babylon, God chooses to give dreams to Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, and to give Daniel the gift of understanding the dreams and to reveal the dreams to him, because this was considered an important means of receiving messages from the gods in Babylon. I think this serves both to elevate Daniel in the Babylonian court and to demonstrate the supremacy of his God, Yahweh. But it also enables Yahweh to communicate with the Babylonians in a medium that they expect to receive messages from divinity. As we've said before, Daniel 2 is a court contest. The story of Daniel is a conflict between two kingdoms. A conflict between the kingdom of God on one hand and the kingdom of men on the other. The kingdom of Judah, Joachim, has been defeated by Nebuchadnezzar, and the kingdom of Babylon on the other, but ultimately between the God of Israel and the gods of Babylon. And Daniel 2 serves to show the superiority and supremacy of Yahweh and of his kingdom over the gods and kingdom of Babylon and its successors through the interpretation of dreams, which was important to the Babylonians. Well, to get into the story, Nebuchadnezzar says in verse 3, "I have a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means." And if you're like me, perhaps you're wondering, why is Nebuchadnezzar troubled by his dream? In Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 3, we're told that a dream comes when there are many cares. I think perhaps Nebuchadnezzar's dream is a product of his subconscious processing of his anxieties and concerns that he's unable to articulate during the light and consciousness of the day. But ultimately, God still uses this dream to speak to the king. And I think if we were to ask what cares could possibly lay behind the king's dream, well, if we think of the fact that later in the story we learn that Nebuchadnezzar goes to bed thinking about the future and that his dreams are about a statue of a man that gets destroyed, this can help us understand perhaps what is disturbing the king. You see, kings normally erected statues of themselves to represent their authority throughout their kingdom. So Nebuchadnezzar would likely think that the statue in his dream represented him. And since dreams were thought to be omens by which the gods communicated good or bad events to take place in the future as warnings, it seems that Nebuchadnezzar wonders whether his dream was an omen about the end of his kingship. I think his dream reflects his insecurity, despite all of his power. Insecurity, I think, comes from knowing that we're not all that we are pretending to be. And it produces a desperate fear that we'll be found out to be a farce if it's discovered that we are less than the images we are projecting to the outside world. So Nebuchadnezzar, in my view, is desperate to know what his dream means in order to deal with his fears. And his ensuing anxious and unreasonable and desperate violent actions towards his wise men reflects his internal fears and insecurities. I don't believe I'm overly psychoanalyzing the king. I believe the story gives us the impression of someone who is desperately afraid of the events of his dream coming to reality. Well, let's keep reading. We read next. Then the astrologers answered the king, "May the king live forever. Tell your servants a dream, and we will interpret it." The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I've firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream is, or what my dream was, and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble." What a nice guy. "But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you'll receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." Nebuchadnezzar is a really likable fellow. Well, we read here in verses 4 to 6 that one group of the wise men, they're called the astrologers, they respond, "May the king live forever." Now, this was a conventional greeting to the king, but the greeting itself reveals a king's pretensions to power. You see, the reality is that Nebuchadnezzar is mortal, and no matter how powerful he was, death would bring an end to all his power. And so his courtiers have to be greeting him with the wish that he would live forever, because the moment he dies, then he's no longer king and he no longer is powerful. Well, they ask him to tell them the dream, and then they say they would interpret it. In fact, that was a standard practice with dream interpretation. The person who had the dream would relate their dream, and the wise men would look in their dream books to see what those books said was the meaning of a dream with a similar omen. Well, the king responds that he's firmly decided that they must tell him the dream and they must interpret it, or he's going to cut them into pieces and destroy their houses. However, if they do as he says, he will give them gifts, rewards, and great honors. This, I think, is the nature of how human power works in the world. It's a carrot and a stick approach to motivate or cajole the behavior that is desired. This is the way the kingdom of man or the kingdom of Babylon works. It's how it uses its power in seeking to ensure its will, its desire, and results are achieved. It does so by promising rewards for doing what it wants, that's the carrot, and by making threats of violence for failing to do what it wants, that's a stick. And we are well familiar with how the world works in this way and exerts pressure on us to conform to its ways. This is like, the option of likes on social media or cancel culture. That's the carrot and the stick. Or at work, maybe the carrot of a promotion or the stick of being passed over if you don't make work your priority. Or maybe in the political sphere, you can get a visa if you are compliant, or no visa for you if you don't comply. Or perhaps the offer of government aid or no aid, or sanctions or military action if you don't comply with the wishes of the powerful political force. Well, I believe this is the nature of human power, and this is what the king, in his desperate bid to find out what his dream means, is offering or threatening. There is, however, some ambiguity as to whether the king may have forgotten his dream. And, if you've had that experience of dreaming something that maybe bothered you and you get up the next morning, you can't remember, that's what tends to happen when our dreams come face to face with daylight. But perhaps the king remembered his dream, but he was so troubled by it that he insisted that his diviners told him what the dream was, because then he could be assured that there was a supernatural element at work in their interpretation and they weren't just making it up. And so he says, "Tell me." And in the original language, that is literally "cause me to know." And if you read the ESV, you'll see that translated as "make known." And this might suggest that the king was not able to remember the dream fully himself, and so he wanted his diviners to jog his memory. So he tells them, "Cause me to know," by making the details known first. The alternative is it was simply a test of their abilities, in which case tell me means that though the king remembered the dream, he wanted them to tell it to him as a demonstration of their supernatural abilities. In either event, Nebuchadnezzar clearly does not trust his wise men who practice divination, and he's desperate to find out the meaning of the dream. Well, Joyce Baldwin suggests there's every likelihood that Nebuchadnezzar had forgotten the details of the dreams that had been haunting him. Consciousness naturally resists anything unconscious and unknown, but to be unable to recall the dream only added to the king's anxiety, and therefore to his irritability. According to Eastern superstition, it was ominous not to be able to remember a dream. If a man cannot remember the dream he saw, it means his personal God is angry with him. Until the dream was both recalled and interpreted, it hung over him as an evil dream, bothering and defiling him. Well, I believe that is one alternative. The other one is that the king remembered, but he's just intent on making sure that the wise men are not pulling the wool over his eyes. Whichever way you go, if you look at the ESV, you'll see that they've gone with the "make known to me" translation. Their translation reads in verse 4, "Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, 'O king, live forever. Tell your servants a dream, and we will show the interpretation.' The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, 'The word for me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn from limb to limb.'" Notice those words, "make known to me. And your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation." So that translation tends to side with the view that the king could not remember. The ESV also, you will notice, has the words in Aramaic, which is not in the NIV. You notice it says that the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic. Interestingly, that's a point at which the text switches from Hebrew to Aramaic, and it continues in Aramaic all the way to the end of chapter 8. I don't think this means that the king was being spoken to in Hebrew or Akkadian or some other language, and then they switched to speaking to him in Aramaic. Most likely, this is a marginal textual insertion to simply show where the Aramaic begins in the text. It's a signal to the reader that the text is switching to Aramaic. But notice also that the text refers to the astrologers as Chaldeans. The NIV has astrologers. And Chaldean could refer to an ethnic group who ruled Babylon during the Neo-Babylonian dynasty and came to refer to the whole Babylonian empire. Or as here in this text, the term could be used to refer to a particular expertise in divination and astrology possessed by the Chaldeans, and as such was a reference to the astrologers. Well, let's see if we can keep reading. Once more, the astrologers replied, "Let the king tell his servants a dream, and we will interpret it." Then the king answered, "I am certain that you're trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there's only one penalty for you. You've conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me." The wise men respond by repeating their request for the king to follow the standard practice for interpreting dreams and do what's reasonable by telling them what his dream was. But the king responds in turn by spelling out why he refuses to tell them the dream. Now, either he doesn't believe they have the powers they profess, and he thinks it's a sham, and they're going to conspire together and tell him a lie. So his way of ensuring they aren't making up stuff is to require them to tell him the dream first. Or alternatively, he believes that they are conspiring against him by knowing what the meaning of the dream was, not the meaning, what the dream was, and so they were aware that the dream portended some kind of bad omen, and as a result, they were unwilling to tell him the truth. And by this he means they are conspiring against him. That view is expressed by Aubrey Buster and John Walton in their commentary, and I'll just read what they say. Anidan, that's a word there for time in the text, was a particular kind of time. It was a diviner's job to assess what kind of time it was. A diviner is a fortune teller, someone who could tell what not so much a fortune teller, but someone who could tell what the future was. And their job was to assess what kind of time it was and whether a favorable or unfavorable shift in that time was approaching. Instead of accusing the sages of desiring a greater quantity of time to determine the dream, Nebuchadnezzar accuses them of already possessing a secret knowledge concerning the limits of his own Edan, or time, the limits of his fate. He fears that they already know what an unfavorable time is approaching for him and are withholding that information. That the king does not view their inability to recount his dream as incompetency, but as intentional treason is explicitly stated in 2 verse 9. He does not think they're simply stalling because they do not know how to divine his dream. He accuses them of knowing that a change of time is on the horizon. As noted earlier, an Edan is a period of time characterized by a particular quality, and it can include the time set for the beginning and end of a king's reign, or the beginning and end of divine favor or disfavor. These times are decreed by the gods. See Daniel 2:21. In this case, the king is very likely accusing them of knowing that a time approaches that will be unfavorable for the king, and that they have conspired to hide it from him. Well, that is one view expressed by Buster and Walton. But in any event, the king is afraid, and he doesn't trust his wise men, and so he doubles down on his unreasonable request. And this unreasonable request reflects the nature, I believe, of how power is exercised by human powers. The king is going to get his way by even insisting on what is impossible for others to do. But this insistence, this reaching for the levers of power to achieve his own ends, I believe exposes the fact that the king's power is unable to achieve what he desires. He is impotent. It demonstrates the impotence of his power. Because the king would not be able to elicit the result or answer he wanted, despite all the violence or rewards in the world that he offers or threatens. Notice again the king's threat of violence. He tells them, if you do not tell me the dream, there is only one penalty for you. He is reaching for whatever he can to seek to achieve the result that he desires. Well, let's read what happens next. In Daniel 2:10-11, we read that the astrologers answered the king, "There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live amongst humans." So the astrologers tell the king, no one on earth can do what you're asking. And no king, no matter how great and mighty, has ever asked of their wise men what you're asking. And they go further to say that what he asks is too difficult, and it can only be revealed by the gods, and the gods do not live among humans, meaning humans do not have the kind of access to the gods to receive the revelation that the king is demanding of his wise men. Well, J. Paul Tanner, I believe, usefully offers the following quotation. He says that this sets the stage for the demonstration by the true God of heaven that he can and does reveal knowledge to man. He can do what the Babylonian wise men claim is impossible. Verses 10-11 point out the limitations of human wisdom and knowledge, even when aided by occultic techniques. In every stage of history, man is insufficient to understand the universe around him, especially the spiritual realm. No matter how advanced science becomes, there is a limit to man's knowledge. Man needs special revelation from God. And if he's willing to listen to God, he can have the answers to life's most significant questions. So, what the Babylonian wise men say is true. What the king asks is impossible for any human to do, and it can only be done by a god. They admit the limitation of their divination without the aid of divine power. So we've seen first that the king is limited in his power. He can't get them to do what he wants despite all the threats and all the promises of reward he offers. But the wise men themselves admit that they are limited in their power to tell the king what he desires. They need the help of God. But where the wise men are wrong is in thinking that there is no God who would reveal the mystery to mortals. And this is because the wise men do not know Daniel's God. So we read, the diviners correctly believed that this request required the insight of a deity, actually of the true God, to fulfill. In their theology, the abode of the gods is remote in heaven. Unlike Daniel's God, these deities do not deal directly with men, which may be why the diviners do not bother to pray to these gods to save them. And I'm quoting here from Joe Sprinkle's commentary on the book of Daniel. See, Daniel's God, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, is different than the God or gods of the Babylonians. Whereas the Babylonian gods were aloof and do not dwell with humans or reveal mysteries directly to humans, in their minds, they only reveal mysteries indirectly through their dream books. We will see that in keeping with the revelation of Yahweh in the Holy Scriptures, that he is a personal God who wants to dwell with humans, as is clear from the creation stories in Genesis. Yahweh is a God who's personally concerned about his people and relates in a personal way to them. He's a God with whom you can have a relationship. He's a God whom you can pray to and ask him to reveal mysteries which only he knows. And he can and will, if it pleases him, answer those prayers by revealing these mysteries to his people for their good, as we'll see that he does in response to Daniel's prayer. Well, in verse 12, we read, this made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. So Nebuchadnezzar loses it because he can't get his way, and he orders that all the wise men be put to death. And this shows us that you can't tell human imperial power that what it acts cannot be done. Nebuchadnezzar's response reflects the nature of human imperial power that is accustomed to and insistent on getting its own way because it has power. It responds like a spoiled child to its will being thwarted and to not getting its own way. It also reveals the limits of human power, and that human power is deceived in thinking that it is all powerful. Despite all the power in the world, there are some things that human power cannot procure, even with threats and rewards. And so, in this way, human power's lie about its ultimate power is being unmasked. The story so far shows us that despite Nebuchadnezzar's pretensions to being or having the ultimate power, he really does not. He's limited in his power and subject to God, who is the one who's really sovereign and in control. Nebuchadnezzar is king, but he's subject to God in his dreams, which trouble him. And possibly he can't even remember, or certainly he cannot explain his dream apart from the revelation of God that is given through Daniel. Despite all the various types of advisors Nebuchadnezzar has, whether the magicians or enchanters, sorcerers or astrologers, none of them could interpret his dream. And despite all this power and the pretensions of the Babylonian Empire and its gods, they lacked insight and understanding to the future, which only God could give. But Daniel and his friends, despite their privileged position in this society, are also in danger. They're subject to the whims and fancies of the king and to the change in his temper and tantrums like a shifting wind. This sets up for us to see the message of the book. Despite present difficulties, God is in control and he will have the final word. And as we apply it to our lives, we see that human power, with all its pretensions to power by threats and promises, is really just a lie. You see, God is the one who alone is sovereign and in control, and who's able to take care of us amidst the present difficulties that we face in this world. Whatever our present difficulties are, we need not give in to fear from threats or promises of rewards from this world, because the world and its power over us really is a lie. God is the one who's sovereign and in control. Instead, the book of Daniel urges us to put our trust in God and to fear him, because he is the one who's really in control and will have the final say. In our next video, we'll study Daniel 2 verses 14 to 23, and we'll see how Daniel responds to the threat to his life presented by the king's order. I hope to see you then.